Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm here to do the Bookish boxes and Buzzwords tag. This was created by LizziefayeLovesBooks, and the whole point of this tag is for you to kind of investigate what are the sort of things that make you more likely to pick up a book or make you more likely to really enjoy a book. So you're trying to figure out your favorite elements that you see in books. And I wasn't tagged by anyone to do this, but I was reading the questions and they were really getting me thinking, so I thought I had to make a video about this anyway. So in honor of today's video, I thought I would put on my Always Been Like This t-shirt because we're going to be talking about what a huge weirdo I am. So let's get into the questions. Question number 1 is your go-to genre or favorite type of book. And I actually found this to be the most difficult question out of all of them to answer. I think my favorite type of book would be the novel. I do try to push myself to read widely, but novels are just what I reach for the most and what I tend to enjoy reading the most. But when it comes to genre, my answer feels like such a cop-out if I just say literary fiction classics, since those are what I read the most and tend to enjoy. But that covers such a wide spectrum of things that I feel like literary fiction doesn't really mean very much. So I'm not really sure if there is really a term to describe my favorite type of books, but if I did have to pick one, it would probably be weird. So I like stories that are just very strange, not necessarily grounded in reality. I like books that have experimental writing, or there's a unique structure to the book or way of telling the story. I like books that make me see the world differently or have me question my view of reality. I love exploring the dark side of life, so I tend to enjoy books that are very morbid or macabre. And lastly, I'm just a really nosy person, so I just love books that are full of juicy details, books that have scandals, or that give me lots of compelling information about a completely fictional person's life. So any combinations of those things usually tends to make me really happy. Question number 2, retellings you were drawn to. I think I like retellings that are pretty radical departures from the story that they're retelling, so I'm not as drawn to a straight up beat by beat kind of retelling that is going to keep the structure of the story in the same way. I'd rather see a retelling that takes the story apart, or just picks one part of the story that's often looked over and kind of recontextualizes it. I think the best example of that would be Wide Sargasso Sea. It features a minor character who didn't get a lot of airtime in Jane Eyre, and fully imagines her background story and her circumstances, and what I think is so successful about this is that it completely changes how you think of the original story then. So I think it's really successful. It's not just trying to tell you the same story again in a different setting, but it's actually challenging the original and it can change your perception of that. So I think that that is a really cool kind of retelling. Question number 3 is lifestyles or careers of the book characters. And I have to say for this one, for lifestyles, I'm really drawn to reading about people who exist on the fringes of society, people who are very alienated or they're oddballs or outsiders and they don't really fit in. I love reading about seedy underbellies. For example, when I was reading Les Miserables, the moment where I really knew that I was going to love the book was when Victor Hugo started describing these shady criminals, and he was going through all their aliases and how they would meet up in the sewers in the middle of the night, and bringing in criminals just made me convinced that it was going to be a book that I was really invested in. So I love any kind of shady underground activity. That's great. When I was a teenager, I was really interested in reading books about heroin addicts in particular. I think because a lot of the musicians that I was listening to had problems with heroin, I was just interested in that drug in particular. So some of my teen faves revolved around the seedy lives of drug addicts, so books like Trainspotting and Junkie and Requiem for a Dream were definitely favorites of mine back then. I can't say I read as many heroin books now, but it's still a topic I'm interested in when I see it show up. And lastly, another group of very unconventional people that I like reading about are people who are radicals or have very extreme ideas and live different lives than the people in their communities around them. For example, a nonfiction book that I found so fascinating was one called Strangers Drowning, Grappling with Impossible Idealism, Drastic Choices, and the Overpowering Urge to Help by Larissa McFarker. So this was a book that is all about people who are compelled to do good things to make the world a better place, but these people had such extreme visions of how they need to do good in the world that it often had great personal cost to themselves and the people around them. So I found this kind of book just so fascinating to get into the minds of these kind of people who are committed to these extreme lives. As for careers for book characters, I love reading about artsy people who follow their passions and have very creative, fulfilling lives. I especially enjoy reading about musicians, since music is something I'm very passionate about and something that I've studied. But I will really read about any kind of artist. I love reading about the creative process, so I'm happy to read about visual artists and actors and filmmakers and writers, anything like that. It's all good. I also enjoy reading about people who have a similar profession to the one that I work in, so any book in the educational sphere is one that I'll probably find to be an interesting read. So whether it's reading about other high school teachers like myself, or if it's about college professors, or any kind of mentor-student relationship, I'm usually very compelled to read those stories. I also enjoy reading about characters who are more in the working class, so I find that that's very underrepresented in literary fiction. You know, it's not as glamorous. It's definitely easier to find books about richer characters who are facing more like emotional difficulties than real people in their everyday lives with kind of more financial concerns. I just find those books rare, and I usually enjoy them when I find them, like A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin, I thought was a great example of that. This made me realize that I really don't see enough stories set in laundromats featuring single moms, so I really appreciated this collection for that. Question number 4 is places or settings you were drawn to. And oddly enough for this one, the first thing that came to my mind was books that are set in some kind of imagined afterlife. So I love reading books that are set in graveyards or crypts. One example of that would have to be Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. This entire novel is set one night in a graveyard. I also really enjoyed the scene in The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, where the characters descend into the underworld and they have this kind of realization about why they're on Earth and what their purpose is in life. I found that really powerful when I first read this as a 12-year-old, and I still found it to be pretty deep when I reread this again in my 20s. And then, of course, the big boy on the block would have to be Dante's Divine Comedy. Features these really creative, imaginative, immersive depictions of hell, purgatory, and heaven. But of course, we all know that Inferno is the most fun of the Divine Comedy. There is so many grotesque and gruesome and depressing and pathetic visions in this poetic tour through the underworld. I just found it fascinating. As for places that are real and exist on Earth, I do tend to enjoy reading about more extreme climate areas. So I like reading places set in the far north. I like reading about the Canadian Arctic. Love books set in Russia, also interested in Scandinavia as well. But then I also like reading about more steamy, oppressively hot and humid southern climates as well, particularly books set in the American South. And lastly, I really enjoy books that are deeply immersed in nature. One of my favorite books of last year was The Overstory by Richard Powers, and this is really just a book about trees in many different varieties in many different places. So just the setting of just being in so many different woods and forests was just such a wonderful experience for me. Not only did this book just draw me into its own world of trees, but it also did push me out and encourage me to spend more time outdoors among trees, finding all the great trees that I live near. So I think that that was a really powerful setting to do that. Question number 5 is relationships you enjoy reading about. I have to say dysfunctional relationships of any variety. I'm so interested in the ways that we can love each other and yet deeply hurt each other at the same time. I particularly love books with dysfunctional family settings. There's something so strange that a child is just born into a family. You really can't choose your family, and for a certain amount of time you can't really get away from them or leave them, and I'm just so interested in the way that parents influence their children children, how siblings can grow up in the same environment and yet still have such a different perspective or understanding of how they grew up, and they can turn out so differently. I love any kind of multi-generational family story that talks about different genetic traits or bad patterns that have been repeated throughout the family for history. So I just love those kind of relationships. But I will happily read about dysfunction in any format, whether it's like a dysfunctional teacher-student relationship or friend situation, friendships that are just rivalries or competitive or a bit twisted, books like Passing by Nella Larson, the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, or Sula by Toni Morrison, I think are very interesting. And of course, dysfunctional relationships, any kind of love affair that is just going to be bitter and painful and twisted, I'm there for that. So I think that's ultimately why Wuthering Heights is such a successful book for me, because you can check off many different types of dysfunction in this book. You definitely have the dysfunctional family thing going, and it also takes dysfunctional romantic relationships to an extreme as well. So that's, I think, why I partly love this novel so much. Question number 6 is buzzwords in the title of the book. I couldn't think of any specific buzzwords. Rather, I'm looking for a title that is going to conjure up some kind of mood or is going to intrigue me in what's going to happen in the book. When I was looking through my shelves, one of the buzzwords that seemed to come up was the word kill. So I have My Sister the Serial Killer. I think I was interested with it being this like close family member, but also being this super violent person. And then we also have A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. And I remember seeing this one in the bookstore, not knowing anything about it, but I thought it was fascinating that this book was called A Brief History when it's so clearly long. So I liked the joke in the title, and 7 Killings suggests that a lot of drama is going to go down in this book. Of course, you know, if you've read it, they were like way more than 7 killings, so not accurate, but you know, catchy title. I also found some other titles that I probably picked up in part because they sound like they're going to be such moody and strange books. So we have The Melancholy of Resistance, we have Beware of Pity, Autobiography of a Corpse, and lastly, I have a book that I know I bought because of the title when I was a teenager, and that is Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. And I actually ended up really loving this book. It did become one of my favorites, but you have to love a title that is just so bold and really makes you intrigued with what's going to happen in this book. Question number 7 is things on book covers that draw you in, and I have so many books to show you for this one. So one of the first things that I realized I really enjoy seeing on covers are many different variations of what I would call strange looking faces. So for example, there's cool looking strange faces, like on the collected stories of Clarice Lispector. There was something that is so mesmerizing about the way that Clarice looked that I didn't know anything about this book, but I just had to pick it up because it was so hypnotic. But then there are also a lot of weird book faces that are definitely more on the creepy side, like this new recent reissue of John Williams' book Nothing But the Night, which, you know, I couldn't not pick up after seeing these weird little old men baby things on the cover. So I'm just going to show you a few more of the weird face books in my collection. There's The Book of Disquiet, Arctic Comics, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti, Pinocchio, which I had no interest in reading ever until I saw this hilarious and terrifying cover. Hark the Herald Angels Scream. Also the books in the My Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgaard. I used to leave these lying around my house to try to scare my stepdad because he's like so intense on the cover of these books. And for one last creepy guy on a book cover, here's The Life and Times of Gregory Rasputin. Clearly an iconic book cover. Somewhat connected to creepy face covers, I also really enjoy books with skulls on the covers. So I guess that's kind of like a creepy face just with all the skin and tissue removed. So here is a copy of Under the Volcano that I bought. I already owned a copy of this book, but this one had a skull and a New Afterwards by William T. Vollmann. So those were just two things that could completely justify me buying a new copy and upgrading that book. And then I also have If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I heard that this book is kind of like a knockoff of The Secret History, which I didn't really love, so I don't think I'm gonna quite really love this book, but you know what? It's got a big skull on it, and it's about Shakespeare, so I'm gonna give it a try. I also really enjoy covers that have animals or some kind of weird animal creature on them, such as this one, The Erstwhile by B. Catling. I have no idea what this book is about. It was a total cover buy. I don't know what this thing is, but I really want to find out. I really love books that feature reptiles of any kind. So for example, here's Freshwater. This was a book that I sort of wanted to read, and then I saw that the cover had a two-headed snake, so that's when I definitely committed to buying this one. We've also got Swamplandia by Karen Russell with a nice gator on the cover. And then I have this collection of short stories called Wide Awake in the Pelican State. So they're some stories from Louisiana writers, and this just has a lovely spine with all sorts of alligators on it. I also enjoy other creepy animals like rats and ravens. You can see a really beautiful raven on this edition of Philip Pullman's Demon Voices. And I also like books that have strange cat-dog creatures on them as well, such as this gorgeous cover for Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James, and The Vine That Ate the South by J.D. Wilkes has a fierce, some kind of mountain cat on there. I also really like They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, which features a totally badass wolf in his tracksuit. On the more aesthetic side, I do really enjoy books with beautiful, intricate design patterns. I could not resist this beautiful edition of The Bone People that features these Maori tattoo designs. And lastly, because I'm partly some kind of bird person, I really enjoy shiny covers. So I love this neon copy of The Musical Brain, but any kind of book that's just like really glistening and shiny is one that I'm just not going to be able to say no to. Apparently, though, the real MVP for cool cover designs has to be Irvine Welsh. There are 6 books of his that I own that meet my criteria for cool covers. So we have Rave that has like an intricate, cool pattern design on it. We have Crime that features a crocodile that is also on the spine. We have The Blade Artist that features a creepy face. And we've got the Trainspotting books. We've got Trainspotting with a skull and Dead Men's Trousers with some dancing skeletons on it, as well as Skag Boys with a cool skeleton puppet here. So Irvine Welsh apparently really gets my aesthetic. Question number 8, nonfiction buzzwords, types of nonfiction you are drawn to. Definitely my gateway into nonfiction as a teenager were books that were about music. I was so obsessively into alternative music, and I just loved finding books, whether they were biographies or memoirs or oral histories or essay collections that had to do with musicians that I liked or particular music scenes. These are the books that really got me hooked on nonfiction. Now I still read music nonfiction, but maybe not as much as I used to, and I kind of read about more of a wider variety of subjects now. I love reading nonfiction in order to learn more about the world that I live in, so I'm really drawn to books that have a lot to teach me about perspectives that are different from my own. So I quite enjoy reading books from Indigenous perspectives, learning Indigenous history and contemporary issues and philosophy. I like reading about global history. I like reading about books that are about books and literature and the act of reading. I like reading weirdly specific history books. So for example, this was one that I couldn't resist picking up. It's called The Arsenic Century, How Victorian Britain Was Poisoned at Home, Work, and Play. So this one just seems like a fascinating look at a really dark topic. Question number 9 is medical or physical conditions of characters. I'm definitely interested in reading about the medieval period, so anytime that the Black Plague pops up, I'm usually pretty interested in what's going to happen. For example, this is a nonfiction book that I saw about the plague, The Black Death, A Personal History. I have a feeling this is going to be a great read. But aside from that, the only other thing that I could think of is that I'm very interested in reading about characters who are neurodiverse or characters who are experiencing mental health issues or mental illnesses. Particularly since I do read a lot of classics, I think it's very interesting to watch how society's view of mental illness has really changed over time. And like I mentioned, I just like reading from perspectives that have a different view of reality from my own. So I'm just interested in how people with these different conditions have a unique way of seeing the world sometimes. And lastly, question number 10, time of year or time in history or future that you are drawn to. I did already mention that I love books set during the medieval period. I find that such a fascinating time. So, for example, here's a book that I could not resist picking up. It's called The Eye Stone, the first medieval noir about the birth of Venice. Like, how could I resist picking up a book that is described as a medieval noir? That sounds perfect. So, love any books from that time period. I've also noticed that I really enjoyed reading about the aftermath of significant historical events. So for example, I won't necessarily be drawn to pick up a book that is set during the Civil War, but I know that I'm much more interested in reading a Faulkner novel that is dealing more with the consequences of the Civil War and how that's affecting characters' lives. So I guess I'm more interested in the aftermath and how those serious major events shook up a society and how people deal with that afterwards. So that's it for the Bookish boxes and Buzzwords tag. I think there are 2 more bonus questions, but it's already well past midnight as I'm filming this, and now I have to go and reshelve all the books that I dragged off to show you their cool, weird covers, so I'm gonna leave it there for the night. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed getting to know me and my tastes as a reader a little bit better. Please let me know if we share any similarities, or if you have different answers for these questions. I'd love to hear what you think. So that's it for today, and I'll see you again later. Bye!